Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Fortifying Your Faith. I'm your host, Haston Hanley, and I'm so glad you can be with us today as we are going to be continuing looking at our study on a challenge to change our worship. And the intention is this is going to be the last week to discuss worship. Lord willing, next week we're going to be talking about being available and changing our availability for the Lord. But before we get there, I would like for us to spend some time discussing the dangers of ignorant worship. Because if we attend worship every Sunday, if we are very faithful in many aspects of our life, but yet we don't know God, or we don't know anything about worship, maybe we just go there because it makes us feel better, rather than actually going to worship God, then we need to be willing to address that and change our mindset towards it. So, what's the problem with ignorant worship? So if we stop and go to Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in, I believe it's verse 6, right after the Hebrew author is speaking about Enoch, he brings up a very interesting point about faith. He that has faith, believes that there is a God, and that God is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. I believe the exact phrasing is, he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Can we have faith without believing that there is a God? Obviously, the answer, according to Hebrews 11 and verse 6, is no. We cannot have faith in God without knowing God, or at least knowing about God. Ignorance is a very big problem, because by definition it is lacking the knowledge or awareness of something. It can be either uneducated or unsophisticated. And so what is it that we need to stop and consider when it comes to ignorant worship? John 4 and verse 24, a passage we have come back to countless times throughout this study in particular. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. If we are lacking in either spirit or truth, then we are lacking in proper worship. But ignorance is lacking in both of those things. You see, we've discussed this in some sense. We've looked at insincere worship. Maybe that's worshiping in truth but without spirit. We've looked at improper worship, worshiping in spirit but not in truth. So now we come to the point of ignorant worship, where there's neither spirit nor truth. You're just kind of letting the wind blow you wherever you go and say this is worship. Jesus addressed this even to the Samaritans. If you back up 2 verses, he brings it up directly. You worship who you do not know. You worship what you do not know. Is that going to benefit anything? Is that going to give glory and honor to God? Is that going to fulfill our need, our responsibility, and our focus as a Christian if we just kind of don't know what we're doing? We're just doing it. The answer in my mind is no. Because if we are not worshiping God in a proper way, then it's improper worship. We discussed that last week. So ignorant worship is just as bad, if not worse. You can go over to maybe a more commonly used passage, and that would be Acts chapter 17. When we get to the point where Paul is in Athens, where he's standing up and preaching to them, he's warning them about who they're worshiping. In fact, if we back it up, they were so focused on learning something new, beginning in verse 22, that they put Paul in the best spot to speak. And so, excuse me, I said Acts 17 verse 30. I meant Acts 17 and verse 22 is when he begins preaching, and we'll get there in a moment. Backing up even further in the chapter, rather, verse 16. There we go. Paul is preaching and they're eating it up because it's something they didn't know, talking about a God that they did not know. And so we get to verse 22, Paul's standing on Mars Hill and he looks out towards the Pantheon, towards this great building, towards this center of worship for this group of people. And he says, "You men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are," the King James has, "too superstitious." Many of the newer translations denote this as overly religious. They're willing to worship and worship and worship, but they never took the time to know who they were trying to worship. In fact, he says, "For as I passed by and beheld your devotions looking at your idols," he said, "I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God." They were so religious, they were worshiping so much, they had an idol set up to say, well, in case we have missed a God, here's a God or an altar to a God that we don't even know about. He says, "Whom therefore you ignorantly worship. Him declare I unto you," or him I am going to explain to you, teach to you, preach to you. And then he goes into telling them about God. Do you think in Athens, when they were worshiping to that altar of an unknown God, do you think that was acceptable to God? I would argue to say no. So why is it that so many times we think our worship must be acceptable to God, even if we don't worship in spirit or in truth? Maybe we're worshiping ignorantly because we don't know God. Maybe we're worshiping ignorantly because we don't really know what worship is. Maybe we're worshiping ignorantly because we just don't put any mind or thought into it. When we started this discussion on a challenge to change, it was to ask these hard-hitting questions, to ask these uncomfortable questions, to say, is there something in my life? Is there something in my worship, my devotion to God that needs to change? Because if there is, I want to make that change. Are we willing to make that decision? Are we willing to have that maybe uncomfortable conversation? Are we willing to put in the effort to grow closer to God and to actually change our relationship with God? Because if the answer is no, then that's all right, and I suppose you can pick up next season. But really and truly, they're questions that we need to ask and we need to answer. So next week, I hope you'll come back, so that way we can all sit down together and discuss the need to change our availability for the work of the Lord, so that we can fulfill our promises, our commandments, and our duties as a Christian. But until next week, let's continue to study, let's continue to grow so that we can all fortify our faith.